general, how did the students respond to the course? You gave us already lots of examples, I think, but did you notice in particular any changes in their attitudes from the beginning to the end? Anything that struck you in particular?
Yeah, so the students were very forgiving to me for throwing so much at them. Every week it was a bit of a joke around what are we doing today? Because I think it's really important, as I said, that we did something meaningful and practical in those practical sessions. So it was often quite an interesting range of practical tasks that I asked them to do. And in general, they were very, very good at engaging with those and trying to maximize the value from those sessions to try and do something, to gain and learn something. And I think what I noticed the most in terms of the changes was actually the types of questions they asked, and not necessarily even just to my module. It would be, so I teach another module on psychological assessment. So it was on, things like testing for cognitive ability, and they also had a module on well-being. And you could see that the nature of questions that they were asking changed, as the module developed and they began to have a greater kind of confidence to be able to question things. And so, why did they do this? That clearly doesn't sound right. And they were absolutely right. Things were problematic. And so I think that was, for me, the key transformation. I did see a way of thinking that had changed, and it was much more in line of that open science type approach, which is, okay, well, why didn't they share their data? Or why haven't they declared a conflict of interest? And those sorts of questions. And I think those are the most important ones, because they're the things that aren't written down necessarily always. And so we saw lots of interesting kind of responses, and particularly in those other modules where they'd say, okay, but how does this relate to, why was this not pre-registered? This seems like the most obvious thing to pre-register because, for example, the way they'd set it up, they'd done all the work beforehand. So it was a really interesting kind of change. And in terms of the assignment, actually, I think the one thing that I took away was that I think often people think there's one right way of doing things. And I think one thing I need to do, and we can all do more of, is saying that there's not always a right answer. There's not always a perfect way of doing things. I supervise a few PhD and professional doctorate students, and my phrase, they must be so tired of me, is justify it. Like, justify it. Because ultimately, if there's no right or wrong, then actually the quality of the work is in how well you justify it. So yes, you've chosen this sample rather than this type of sample. Well, if you can explain why you did that and give us a transparent, critical, engaged conversation about that, then that's brilliant. That's what we're looking for. We're not looking for a right answer. And I think with this type of assignment where there's lots of flexibility, I think everybody wants to see that there is a right answer or that there's a right way of doing things. And that's why I was really keen to share their assignments afterwards, to be able to say, look, there's loads of ways of doing it. There's no right or wrong. So it's about you demonstrating you have those skills and you have that kind of ability to be critical and engage with things at that more meaningful layer. And so I think that again, that kind of taps into that different way of thinking. So that we're open to the fact that there's lots of different interpretations of the same data. So what conclusion is the most valid? Well, that's a silly way of thinking about it. We should actually think about, can we draw this conclusion from it? And if so, what are the other sources of evidence that might support or contradict that? And that way of thinking, I think, has been really powerful in promoting what has turned out to be a much more critically engaged group of a community of students. And we saw that in their dissertations, where I've ran a big collaborative project, and the types of questions they would ask, and why aren't we doing this, or why didn't we account for this when looking at this? And these were excellent thoughts that I myself had overlooked when designing this pre-registered project, and I think that's a real testament to their development in way of thinking.
And in terms of the materials or the assignments themselves, like the reading or the writing process, the types of materials that you prepared? Did you notice any challenges from the students? Did they complain about anything, or like, this is too much to do, this is not enough, I would like to have more? Like, did you receive any type of feedback?
Yeah, that's a good point, and I will happily share my wins with my losses. So I will focus on the critical. I think the one of the things was, gosh, there's a lot of reading to do, and in some ways, that's a really hard thing to respond to. Well, yes, of course it is. This is a master's level course designed to give you the confidence to do this quicker, better, and in a different way, whilst also acknowledging that reading is quite taxing and that it can be hard to know what to read, where to prioritize your time and things like that. And so that was a significant, I think, factor in perhaps changing the way I've delivered it this year to emphasize less on the need for lots and lots and lots of reading. Obviously, that's a very important skill. And I say, it's like a muscle. You practice it, you get quicker, and you get more efficient in extracting what you want from reading. And so it was a more creative tasks to avoid, read a paper and then critique it type thing. So trying to think about things in a slightly different way. So there were lots of, I guess, positives and negatives. I think I've shared some of the highlights, so I'm very happy to perhaps be a little bit critical. I think one of the core things when you're engaging with these things, and when I was throwing lots of different activities, sometimes being able to label the skills that you've got and being able to find a way to think that, to recognize the practical value of it and to be able to convince others of that value. So I'm thinking very specifically when we think about the university's employability agendas of, do they recognize the skills that these sorts of activities are giving them, the developments they're making, and do they understand then how to transform that and to use that for their employability benefit? So some of the feedback that I got from some colleagues was perhaps that could be more explicit. We could do more with being really clear about what we're expecting students to have gained from these experiences. And I think especially when you have a teacher like me, where they throw all sorts of different things at it to get you thinking in those different ways, that students at the end are able to reflect upon those and understand what was the reason why. So I think there's a little bit of work to do with that. And there's also a little bit of work perhaps on changing the style and emphasis sometimes of a few of the sessions to make it less reading focused. I think reading is very important. You do have to practice it. It's very important that we can engage with a lot of different types of sources gained and written for lots of different types of audiences, and to be able to kind of extract useful nuggets of information from them. But perhaps thinking about different ways of encouraging that. And I was trying to be very creative about strategies and tasks I could give that would require that, but not to perhaps the same level.